In this video, I'll show you how to do closed cables. These types of cables start and end without having the typical threaded look of cables. They can be in ring form or they can be offshoots of another cable design that have a closed top, like in hearts or other sorts of shapes. These are a really fun way to add different kinds of motifs to your work, such as the rings. You can do things that look like pineapples, life preservers, all kinds of interesting new options for your cabling. Closed cabling is kind of a neat way to add a different element into your cable designs. In this case, it's just a ring. You could put all sorts of, smiley face things in there, or, this could be the top of a heart motif. This could be the edge of a really intricate Celtic cable. It could be all sorts of things, but basically the same rules apply anytime you're doing closed cables, and there really are only two rules. One is, except for a center stitch, pretty much every stitch of that cable, in this case this is 3 stitches over here and 3 stitches over here, need to be cast on and bound off separately from the rest of the background. What that means is that all of these stitches are extra so that they don't actually compromise the way the fabric will lay. Because generally in cables, because you keep the same number of stitches across the entire piece, you won't really have any fabric buckling. But in this case, because of the nature of this type of cable and the fact that in order to close it you essentially do have to bind off, you need to cast on the same number of stitches that you're going to bind off at the end. So that way this is sort of its own little isolated motif, and you won't have to worry about at the bottom here having a bunch of ripples or anything extra kind of hanging out. So when you start, there's a combination of different increases that you do to get the number of stitches that you want. In this case, again, it's 3 stitches on each side. It could be 2, it could be 4, it could be anything you want, but basically you have to cast on however many stitches on each side will actually be cabled. So if your closed cable is just going to be one loop of 3 stitches, you only have to cast on 3 stitches. In this case, there's 2, goes in 2 different directions, so 3 here, that's a total of 6. So there'll be a center stitch, you can see it right here. It's a centered double increase here, and then a make one and a make one right and make one left. Now, you don't have to get so fancy as to do all of that. You could do other basic types of increases, but that just makes it look a little bit more clean. So, now what that casts on as well is you're taking one stitch and you're adding 1, adding 2, and adding 1. So that's basically adding 4 of your extra stitches, and then in the next row you're going to add 2 more. So, make one right, and you do your increase here, which I'm just going to quickly do. So I'm adding 2 stitches and make one left, and that's the beginning. These things start out small, but they get pretty interesting pretty quickly. So then you just want to work across the rest of your motif. The second row, this is probably the only time you'll encounter this in this, whether you're going in the round or flat with this sort of thing. Any extra increases, and there are in this case, are on essentially the wrong side row. So you just have to kind of keep in mind where everything is in this type of motif. So it's actually a purled increase, a yarn over increase. So it's increasing by 2 by knitting front in the stitch, yarn over, knitting into the back of the stitch, and then you knit into the back of the stitch on the next row. So this is really the only confusing part of a closed cable. But anytime you have a closed cable in a design, you're going to have a legend that goes with it that should explain very clearly exactly what it is you need to do. And generally speaking, it's all going to be very simple concepts. They're just sort of all stacked on top of each other, so it looks a little bit more daunting than it actually is. And I'm showing you this kind of crazy one on purpose, because this is kind of the worst case scenario, as it were. Because in this case, you've got a lot of extra stitches to cast on. They're going somewhere very quickly. So there's the knit in front, yarn over, in the back. And then, of course, purling, because this is the wrong side. And then in the next row, the cables actually start to move. So these ones are moving pretty far, pretty fast. And one good thing about that actually is that any of the funny ripples that you'll get by having now 7 stitches in the center there where you 2 rows ago had only 1 will be taken up by the fact that these 3 stitches are moving really far over, so it's actually going to pull in any of that extra fabric and keep it nice and flat looking. And this first one here is 3 over 3. And you see it moves to 3 over 2, 3 over 1, and that gives you the nice smooth circle shape. So there's 3. I'm going to grab my trusty double-pointed needle, aka my cable needle. Now, of course, the center of this ring, if you wanted to start by trying a ring, it doesn't have to be reverse stockinette. It could really be anything. You could put moss stitch in there, seed stitch, stockinette, anything you like. You could even put more cables in it. And in fact, if you have a copy of Barbara Walker's Charted Knitting Designs, this is actually one of the cables in there, and it has all sorts of different variations that you can work out, which I think is pretty cool. And so now this cable is moving over on the other side, and you'll be able to see just how this whole thing began. Just get a couple stitches away here. And you start to see that you've got 2 sets of 3 stitches, all starting from what looks like a central point here, moving in opposite directions, but not affecting the fabric around it. Now, any little holes like this, obviously there's going to be a lot of stress on some stitches where you've done the increasing. That'll even out in blocking and things like that. Right now it's just still under a lot of stress because the stitches are still pretty taut, having just been cabled. But in a few rows you'll see that that'll change. So now all the cabling is done, and all that's left to do is remove all those stitches that were cast on to create the 2 arms of the cable. So we're going to be removing 6 stitches by doing essentially a knit 7 together. Now, it's not as hard as it sounds, but the way you do this in closed cabling is very important to how it looks. You wouldn't just want to pick up all 7 stitches and knit them together. What you're actually going to do is essentially just have 1 stitch with all of the extra stitches passed over it in a certain order to make it look like it was knitted together at the top. So you can kind of see what that looks like on the bottom one. So what you do is you pass stitches from the first arm to your right hand needle without working them. And let's see, in this case, this will be a background stitch, so purl into that. And then you take 1 stitch from one side, and you want to pass this slip stitch, you want to slip the stitch over what you just knit. So there you go, that one. And then this is the closest stitch from the other side that was slipped. And you want to pass that one over. And you essentially just keep passing this back and forth and passing the next one over. And the next one. And the next one. and the final. And that's all you do. So instead of actually knitting all those stitches together, this kind of weaves them together more than knits them together. But then again, just like with the way you start out the closed cables, where you're adding in the stitches and it doesn't affect the fabric itself, this just goes back to the original shape and size of the fabric, and so the closed cable just sort of sits on top of it. It's like a separate little floating entity there right on top. So that's really the only things you need to know when you're going to do a closed cable is you need to cast on the number of stitches for each part of the cable that will end up closed. So in this case it's 6, and you need to bind off those stitches in a very particular way so that they look woven. And that is all you need to know to do closed cabling.